You know, we're often told that the formal economy is this pristine temple. It's public, it's legal, it's audited, and it's strictly regulated for our own good. And the underground economy? Well, we're basically taught that it's a sewer, a dark place crawling with predators, rule breakers, and total chaos. But what if I told you that for millions of people across history, when those formal systems totally failed, when the local banks shuttered their doors, and when the government simply threw up its hands and said, hey, you're on your own, that so-called sewer was actually a vital, life-saving safety net? Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to completely challenge conventional wisdom and dive into 20 dangerous underground economies that didn't just survive in the shadows, they actually worked. We're talking about illegal hustles that fed families, paid the rent, and kept entire communities afloat when no one else would.
Okay, let's dive into this by heading straight back to Harlem, New York, right in the absolute thick of the Great Depression. Imagine this, the white-owned banks on the corner absolutely will not take your deposits because of the color of your skin, and they certainly aren't going to give you a loan to start a small business. So if you need a lifeline, you don't go to a traditional lender, you go to Stephanie St. Clair. Known to the streets as the numbers queen, she ran an illegal daily lottery. And get this, at its peak, her empire was turning over roughly $20 million a year. Let that sink in. $20 million during the Great Depression, that is an absolute fortune. And she didn't just run a criminal gang, actually, scratch that. She ran it like a highly efficient modern CEO.
Now here's where the central paradox gets absolutely fascinating. While the NYPD was constantly trying to kick down her doors, Queenie was taking that so-called dirty money and using it to fund illegal defenses for black citizens who were being railroaded. She paid for tons of coal to heat freezing tenement buildings in the dead of winter. She was out there handing out small business loans that Wall Street wouldn't even glance at. When marginalized people were entirely shut out of the formal economy, she built a massive social safety net out of thin air and illegal bets. And as we're going to see today, Stephanie St. Clair is definitely not just some historical outlier.
So here is the roadmap for today's Explainer. 1. The numbers queen. 2. Vice is a virtue. 3. Survival in the shadows. 4. Information and rebellion. 5. The modern gray market. And finally 6. The great government co-option.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Vice as a Virtue, the original social safety nets.
Let's look at history, because it is literally full of activities that the law labeled as criminal vice, but which actually served as covert financial lifelines. First up is the numbers game we were just talking about. Long before Powerball existed, this illegal lottery basically acted as a people's bank. The bet collectors were out on the streets every day and practically served as informal social workers. Like, if a regular player fell ill, the banker would often just cover their rent for the month. No paperwork, just community trust. Then, think about bootlegging whiskey. During Prohibition, turning corn into illegal white lightning wasn't just about getting a buzz. It actually subsidized rural infrastructure. Moonshine money literally paved the roads and built churches in Appalachian counties that the federal government had completely forgotten about. And what about speakeasy social clubs? They weren't just sketchy rooms for illegal drinking. They were actually some of the very first racially integrated spaces in America. They broke down class and racial barriers that legal, segregated businesses absolutely wouldn't touch. We also have unlicensed fortune-telling. Even though this was heavily banned under fraud statutes, these seers were actually providing highly affordable mental health care. For immigrant women and the working poor, the fortune teller's parlor was often the only accessible therapist they could find. And lastly in this group, chit funds. Across Asia and Africa, these shadow banking circles move billions of dollars annually. Operating totally outside the formal law, they are basically trust-based loan systems. They allow everyday people to buy homes or pay for weddings without ever setting foot inside a fancy skyscraper bank.
Moving right along to Section 2, Survival in the Shadows, Care Work and Basic Needs.
Okay, the stakes in this next category are literally life or death. Take informal midwifery, for example. Historically, when entire communities were barred from hospitals due to strict segregation or extreme poverty, unlicensed midwives stepped up. They provided the only maternal care available, and guess what? They significantly lowered infant mortality rates. Then we have the gray market pharmacy. Look, when the legal price of a totally vital drug like insulin gets jacked up to hundreds of dollars, which is a literal death sentence if you're uninsured, illegal imports from places like Canada or Mexico aren't just a hustle. They become a literal life-saving necessity. Informal day labor is another big one. It's untaxed work, sure, but it provides immediate, cash-in-hand survival money for folks without papers or bank accounts. This is what keeps families fed during brutal economic downturns. Now, midnight electricians. This is a fascinating phenomenon. In slums globally, illegal hookups to the power grid are incredibly dangerous, no doubt about it. Yet those exact wires provide absolutely crucial refrigeration for food and light so kids can actually study at night. Finally, unlicensed street vending. Lacking a $20,000 city permit definitely makes it a crime, but it remains the primary ground-level economic ladder for new immigrants to build capital and feed their families. It's survival entrepreneurship at its core.
Now, what's really interesting about these numbers is the sheer undeniable scale of these underground networks. We aren't just talking about a few loose dollars changing hands in some dark alleyway. Economists estimate that the U.S. informal sector alone is worth around $1.4 trillion. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 5% of the entire U.S. GDP. That encompasses cash-only construction, undocumented labor, and all those survival systems we just discussed. It is a massive parallel economic engine running right beneath our feet.
Let's dive into Section 3, Information and Rebellion, Data and Dignity.
This is where the hustle gets really creative, because securing access to culture and information has driven some incredibly resourceful movements. Consider pirate radio. Back in the 1960s, uptight state media simply wouldn't play rock or soul music. So what happened? Unlicensed ships parked out in international waters and broadcasted it anyway. They preserved youth culture and literally forced the government to diversify the airwaves. And what about Cuban cyber cafes? Facing extreme government internet censorship, everyday citizens actually built an entire offline internet using physical hard drives, literally passing them hand to hand across the country. This underground sneakernet provided a whole generation with uncensored global news and education. Then you have white hat hackers. Before bug bounties were a legal, paid thing, these guys operated strictly in the gray area, exposing software vulnerabilities. They basically acted as a rogue digital militia, forcing lazy corporations to actually protect our private data. Prison stores are another super complex ecosystem. Trading contraband like postage stamps and macro packets might technically be against the warden's rules, but this internal barter economy actually reduces inmate violence by providing a structured, reliable way to acquire basic needs that the prison underprovides. And DIY biohacking? We've got amateur scientists working out of their garages on open-source insulin production. They're engaging in totally unregulated science to directly challenge massive pharmaceutical monopolies. It's wild.
All right, Section 4, the modern gray market, 21st century hustles. These modern systems are the exact things plugging the gaping holes in today's society. Take ad hoc jitney buses. In urban transit deserts where the city buses simply refuse to go, these unlicensed vans pick up ignored shift workers, literally keeping the city's economy moving. Then there's cigarette jobbing, selling single cigarettes on the corner. Yes, it's technically tax evasion, but for the chronically unemployed, it acts as a form of survivalist entrepreneurship that prevents total destitution. And you have to look at the Hawala system. This is an ancient, completely unregulated money transfer system based entirely on human honor. It is a literal lifeline that allows refugees to send money back to war-torn regions where traditional banking infrastructure has literally been bombed out of existence. Next up, swap meet counterfeits. While IP violation is, for sure, illegal, this secondary market allows lower-income individuals to participate in the social signaling that's often required for certain jobs, like having a nice-looking watch or bag without taking on crushing payday loan debt. And finally, community land trusts. What started out as illegal squatting in abandoned buildings back in the 70s and 80s completely transformed neighborhoods. Squatters turned literal crack houses into thriving community centers, eventually forcing cities to grant them legal titles for their sweat equity housing.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the Great Government Co-option, from crime to progress.
And this brilliantly illustrates an undeniable, almost painful historical irony about how these systems evolve over time. Just look at the direct contrast here. On one side, you have Stephanie St. Clair's original underground numbers game. It featured a generous 70% payout rate, actually beatable odds, and the runners functioned as informal social workers deeply embedded in their communities. But then, look at the government co-option. Starting in the late 60s, state governments realized how much cash was flowing, so they copied the exact same model to create the state lottery. But here's the kicker. They dropped the payout to a measly 50%, gave the players much worse odds, and entirely removed the community safety net. They completely sanitized the process and cleverly rebranded it as a voluntary tax for education.
And we see this exact cycle repeat constantly throughout history. It's like a script. Bootlegging was violently suppressed by the state, only to become today's highly taxed, multi-billion-dollar legal liquor industry. Pirate radio was deemed a massive public nuisance, but it laid the exact technological and cultural groundwork for the licensed FM spectrum we use today. And there's unlicensed gray market jitney buses navigating transit deserts? Well, venture capital essentially slapped a smartphone app on that exact shadow model, and today we just call it Uber and Lyft. Historians point out a remarkably consistent pattern here. When a system is operated by marginalized communities just trying to survive, it's criminalized. But when that exact same system is formalized by big corporations or the state, suddenly it's hailed as brilliant innovation.
To really bring our narrative full circle, let's look at what Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen herself, had to say when New York finally launched its official legal state lottery. She said, "I invented that game. Now they call it legal, but it's still poor people's money. The only difference, I gave back. The state builds prisons." That quote is just incredibly powerful. It perfectly underscores the deep complexity of the underground economy. These parallel markets weren't just dens of thieves, they were often vital laboratories for social services. They were places where everyday people built the safety nets that mainstream society completely refused to provide.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to chew on as we wrap up. The next time you hear about some new gray market hustle on the news, maybe don't just immediately write it off as criminal activity. Look a little closer at what basic human need is actually being fulfilled there. Ask yourself, what dangerous underground hustle operating in the shadows today is destined to become tomorrow's celebrated, fully legal industry? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions, and I'll see you next time.